And if you would like to ask a question as we go, please raise a hand or put a comment in the chat and we'll try and bring you in later on. So without any further ado, I will pass on to Henry and we can start the discussion.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everybody. I think I'm going to focus on a few questions which have been raised by Helen Thomas in the FT. If you've seen the article, it's in the FT this week. I don't intend to give Eddie and Luke a hard time, but I think there are some questions which were raised in an article which would be helpful to be answered in this debate. I expect we'll carry on for about 20-25 minutes, after which anyone can join in. But if you have got, as I say, anything urgent, put your hand up in the meantime. First question to both of you. Superfund means quite a lot of things. It's used by various people in various ways. What do you define as superfund, and how does it differ from the other usages?
So let me try and take that, if I may. Is that working? Yeah, so we see a superfund as being a consolidator of defined benefit pension plans, whereby those pension funds are pulled together under one single trusteeship to try to exploit the economies of scale, hopefully pristine governance, and generally give a safer and more secure home to the pension members.
Okay, and the word's been touted about by Nicholas Lyons as the name for his UK growth fund as well. And a lot of people get confused and think super funds are really about giving Eddie Truell and Disruptive Capital and Clara an opportunity to get invested in more aggressive and growth-like assets as opposed to insurance companies. I guess one of the prejudices against you is that you're more interested in yourself and your members. So I'll put that to you and ask you, how do the members benefit from super funds?
Luke, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it kind of comes back to the definition as well, which is the structure is one where the ultimate security is provided by financial covenant, some pool of capital rather than an operating business. And the point is that a super fund is entirely focused on delivering pensions. It's not an operating business with a pension fund attached, and so there is more alignment, I would argue, and therefore the difference between sponsor and member interest isn't perhaps quite as stark as in a regular corporate setup. And I think certainly all of the models that we've seen and the model that we've been promoting for a number of years now has always been very clear that steady and consistent outperformance of assets over liabilities is the thing that really generates the best returns. So it's not about taking more risk. Now I think there's a wider and perhaps quite interesting philosophical discussion about the level of pension, the level of investment risk taken in the pension system as a whole. But that's not specific to super funds, and super funds will always be, if they have the kind of financial design that ours had, and to some extent Clara's, to the extent that we're aware of that, consistent outperformance is absolutely the name of the game, and we would hope to share that benefit with the scheme members and investors in a fully aligned way.
So how does that work? You're a for-profit organisation. Who gets what?
But I mean, I can talk about our model. There are obviously different versions of this that would could potentially exist, but our proposal was always that you essentially view the system as divided into two parts. There's the pension fund itself and a buffer fund. The pension fund must always be kept fully funded, but to the extent that a surplus emerges, that will upstream into the buffer, and provided that a mutually agreed level of overfunding is maintained, any surplus beyond that would be shared. And in our model, it was 2/3 to capital providers, 1/3 to members construct, reflecting our initial thoughts about where the balance of funding would come from in the first place. But there are endless variations that could be designed along that way. But again, in our model, the principle was always that returns to investors would only ever emerge at the same time as improvement to benefits.
A lot of people would sort of argue that a not-for-profit operation was always better than a for-profit arrangement. We've had people like Greg McLean arguing that on this call before.
Well, free money would be lovely,
wouldn't it,
Henry? That's the thing. I mean, the system needs capital, and the way to attract capital is to provide returns. I don't think that there's anything kind of untoward about that. That's just financial reality, and it's perfectly possible. Not always easy, but this is in fact a very easy example of how you can achieve a social purpose alongside attractive returns.
Okay. Another charge which has been levied against super funds is that they're a poor man's buyout, and I think this is reinforced by the concept of the gateway, which the pension regulator wants to put in place to ensure that schemes which are funded to a level of buyout don't get an opportunity to buy into pension super funds. How do you feel about this concept of the gateway in general, and how do you feel about the idea of being the poor man's buyout?
Could I possibly comment as a former chief executive of a pension insurance company? The insurance companies have lobbied very successfully for a gateway test, basically to preserve their patch, if you see what I mean. And I think it's perhaps a little unfair to accuse the TPR of wanting gateway, because I think that's been very much imposed from elsewhere. Indeed, we've been having discussions not just with TPR, but PRA and other people, Treasury. And actually the gateway test as it is currently constructed, and we shall see whether that survives the new guidelines that we're eagerly anticipating, actually has two baleful effects. In that, first of all, it tries to look forward in an uncertain world as to whether a pension fund could possibly afford a full insurance buyout, in due course. Well, if you can tell me what's going to happen in 5 weeks' time, let alone years' time, I'd love to know the answer, please. Secondly, it really slows up and causes a lot of cost and delay for funds that are never, ever going to get anywhere near buyout. And I'm particularly thinking where you've got troubled sponsors or weaker sponsors and not so well-funded pension funds, whereby it's obvious, frankly, you shouldn't have to trawl around the insurance market who aren't remotely interested in actually giving you a quote to prove that they weren't going to give you a quote. So we'd like to see that element of it removed in the first instance. I would secondly suggest that it's essentially anti-competitive and probably falls foul of the sort of competition and market rules in that area. That's probably for another day. But essentially, we think that sponsors, pension fund, what we call seeding pension fund trustees, the old pension fund trustees, should be unfettered in their choice of endgame destination. If they think that the super fund gives their members both a safe and secure home, and secondly, gives them the opportunity to make Christmas bonuses, let's just call it that, the outperformance that Luke was referring to earlier, then that is a choice the trustees should be free to make. As opposed to having an anti-competitive, you must go to and let's not forget, 100% for-profit insurer. And secondly, lose all the pension freedoms that have been so painfully put in place over the last decade or so.
Okay, I can see that Jo has got her hand up, and I think I know the question she's going to ask, which was actually going to be my next question, Jo, but you're probably better at asking it than me. So do you want to take yourself off mute and ask it, or do you want me to ask it for you?
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Okay. Yeah.
Good
We
morning.
can, yeah.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Henry. I'm just interested to know about the process of getting approval from the regulator. It has been a few years. Can you tell us how many times you've applied to the regulator and what the issues are or were?
Let me try and take
You want to
that.
start, Eddie? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So we've had various iterations, as is very much in the public domain, not least in your good journal. Where we've really finished up was the height of the LDI crisis when the TPR's panel was meeting on Superfund. And one of the key issues that's been highlighted, and I think it is actually systemic across the pensions industry, is how trustees can actually discharge their responsibilities in the area of risk management and do that in real time. So we saw pension funds having to make decisions in literally 10 minutes. You know, do you want to close your LDI or not? Do you want to post margin or not? And if you didn't make a decision in 10 minutes, you got closed out. Have a nice day. And I would contend that there are very few, if any, pension trustee bodies that are actually able to make that decision, are resourced to make that decision, and can make that decision without going through their usual, advisors and taking advice and so on. You've got 10 minutes. Do you want to do your deal or not? And millions at stake in those decisions. And we have raised this point with policymakers left and right, because actually, if you are criminally liable, as a pension trustee is these days, for mismanaging your pension fund, that's a pretty high bar. And we think that this whole area needs to be carefully examined, whether for a pension super fund or for a normal pension fund of any variety.
But to Joe's point, Eddie, why was it that the pension regulator was resisting your being appointed?
So the key issue, and I don't think the TPR would mind us saying this, the key issue was around risk, the way in which trustees could exercise fast and effective risk management. And that really was the key issue. And I'm not sure we've necessarily got an answer. In fact, I was talking to the TPR yesterday. I'm not sure they've got an answer, other than by having effectively full-time executive trustees. And that's quite a different construct than is around today in the pensions world.
But that seems to be a fault in the trustee system as it is. It doesn't seem to be a reason to stop you from stepping in and taking over from these trustees.
So I'm saying that was the key, almost existential issue that was on the table. Equally, from our perspective, in terms of attracting the backstop capital, the buffer capital, we needed to see much greater clarity of being able to distribute surpluses both to capital providers and to members. And we had very large capital providers who were not satisfied with the guidelines as they currently were, which said, maybe in 3 years' time we'll have a think about it. That is not an investable proposition. So we were delighted to see the DWP consultation address that head on and provide much, assuming that gets translated into the guidelines, see much greater clarity as to how it would work and how surpluses, if they arise, could be distributed. And so that was, if nothing else in the Mansion House reforms and the subsequent consultation response, that number one meant that those international investors who have a choice, globally a choice as to where to put their money, could actually be attracted to a pension super fund type of model because they can actually get clarity of outcome, assuming good performance.
Okay, so you are likely to resubmit an application for the pension super fund to be a super fund?
We need to see the actual guidelines being published, which TPR tell us will be in the near future. And obviously the devil is always in the detail of those, but certainly if they translate the consultation responses back to back into guidelines. And if they were to, we can also work through these issues around how risk is actually effectively going to be managed, and there may be other models, fiduciary management and so on, to help achieve that. Then we believe that the Pension Superfund is a force for good.
Okay. Of course, one fund. Sorry, Joe, have we answered your question? Do you want to come back on this?
Just follow up quick, Eddie. Were there any other issues raised by the regulator? You've spoken of one, but were there any other outstanding issues?
There, I mean, it was the occasional dot and comma, as you might say, but there was nothing. It was really those two key issues for them and indeed for us that were not easy to address on either side. I mean, Luke, do you think I'm being too simplistic on that?
No, I mean, I think that's kind of where we got to in the final iteration, and there are various twists and turns along the way in terms of balance of powers and governance. Not I think in any way that I'd be about or in the sense that powers in decision making. TPR obviously had a set of rules that were very skewed towards kind of complete trustee control, and obviously, we hadn't designed any system whereby trustee decision making was fettered, but we'd tried to ensure that there was proper alignment with the interests of capital providers too. There's a balancing act here of attracting capital in the first place, as Eddie's discussed. Now, we addressed all of those, and then when you're in the position where all of the decision making does rest with the trustees, it raises that final set of issues that Eddie concluded with. So I mean, it's been a long process, and I think Eddie's been very diplomatic. It's also been not without its frustrations, and there's been, I think, a learning curve with all the stakeholders involved as to how we might successfully get to operating super funds of this type. But hopefully the guidance will be forthcoming. It will be something that we can work with. If it isn't, then we'll have to wait for the relevant legislation when it emerges from DWP. But hopefully TPR will provide a workable framework, and we can consider submitting again.
Okay, I'm very conscious that there are people from Clara on this call, but Clara did get its appointment, and there are two kind of questions which Helen's article, I think, brings up. First of all, what was right about Clara that wasn't right about pension superfunds in the old regime? And secondly, if it was right for Clara to get appointed, why hasn't Clara done any business yet?
Well, I mean, I can have a attempt at those. I don't purport to speak for either Clara or the regulator. So the question of why Clara, not us, is one for TPR, and then the business is for TPR and Clara together. But I'd observed, there is quite a significant difference in the models, and again, I don't think it's a particularly controversial statement to state that there has been, prior to the Mansion House speech, something of a inherent bias towards the insurance market. I think that's pretty obvious to all concerned. And Clara's model is obviously a bridge to buyout. Ours is not. The aim is to establish an enduring occupational pension scheme using the powers of the pension scheme investment framework, and the primary way that we would, under our model, propose to deliver value to members and to providers of capital is through scale. So our vision was always to create a large, unsectionalized, enduring pension fund, and the Clara model was obviously something rather different, holding pension funds on a sectionalized basis for a period of time and then transferring them to the insurance market. So you can make of that, I think, what you will. I don't know if Eddie has any thoughts to add to that.
No, as you say, Luke, I don't think it's for us to tell the regulator or Clara what they're doing. So it's up to them.
Okay, but clearly you can't comment on their current deal flow, and Dan may want to come in at a later stage and make a comment. I think we'll allow that in a few minutes. I'm more interested in comments which are made and regularly made that you're just here too late, that the market has moved on, that it's now a buyout market, not a superfund market. How do you feel about those kind of comments, and what would you counter them with?
Well, there are still thousands of pension funds that and their sponsors that cannot instantly afford a buyout, insurance buyout. Secondly, you've got to severely question whether that's actually a good use of UK PLC money to essentially gold plate their pension funds and to essentially move the money into the gilt market or the high grade corporate bond market for the vast majority of funds. UK corporates have put in, I believe, up until 2021, and I'm sure an awful lot more since, £263 billion of special contributions into their pension funds. I would contend that that is one of the key reasons why UK productivity has lagged behind some of its competitors, because that money's gone into basically into LDI rather than into research and development and business development. And so we believe there is a very significant societal benefit from actually creating a more balanced approach towards pension funds, relieving the corporates of their legacy obligations at the same time as providing members with a decent set of outcomes. And so we can debate how many hundreds of billions would be suitable for a pension super fund, but it's in the hundreds of billions, let's put it that way. And we're very confident that there's a vast market. I would also comment that actually there's a significant shortage of insurance capital around. I mean, I spent many years raising capital for Pension Insurance Corporation, and there's a pretty small universe of buyers that were prepared to actually invest into insurance. And so even if the insurers wanted to capture a greater slice of the pensions market, they themselves are capital constrained as well. So we've got all these factors at play. And certainly from our perspective, we think there's, as I said, hundreds of billions to go for. We don't need to have 100% market share to be very happy.
And why would your backers, the people putting up this capital, be happier to put the money behind you rather than putting the money behind the insurance companies? Is there an obvious advantage to them?
I mean, capital is basically looking, international capital is very, very objective about things. It's looking for a good in our construct, or indeed in a pension insurance construct, it's looking for long-term cash flows and risk-adjusted returns. And we can offer a competitive risk-adjusted return. And, insurers may or may not be able to offer a good risk-adjusted return. And investors will take their choice. But certainly I'm confident that if we can get the right guidelines in place and make this more investable, we will have a very, very significant pot of capital to backstop, several billions of pension funds.
And the cost of capital isn't actually prohibitive for you to do business in this current high interest rate environment?
No, the cost of capital isn't the issue. It's the investability of that capital, as we referred to earlier, in terms of actually providing investors with certainty of outcomes rather than, a vague promise that they might be able to get a return one day. No sensible international investor is going to invest on that basis.
Okay, I'm conscious there are a number of questions coming in, and keep them coming in, guys. But I'm going to finish my questions with one which we really advertised this session on. Eddie, you've said to me and to others that you feel that the TPR is on the warpath and they want to see a new mindset in the pensions industry. Can you explain what you meant by that?
It was interesting. I mean, I'm referring to comments, for example, made by Nausicaa Delphas in the Financial Times, where I read what was on the page, and she was suggesting that if pension funds are not producing better outcomes, and I think that encompasses a lot of things, value for money and so on, that they will be consolidated or wound down. Now, I'm sure some of that was aimed at DC as well as DB, but nonetheless, there seems to be a much more mandated message coming out from TPR, as ask them yourselves, but a much more mandated message coming out that says basically smaller pension funds that aren't very efficient in the way that they operate, that don't have the same levels of governance that the TPR would like to see, certainly don't have value for money, outcomes are not long for this world.
Thank you. Welcome to the people who've joined at 10:30. We did advertise this at 10, but it's very good to see you anyway. Joe has posted the article that Eddie's just referred to in chat if you want to have a look at it. I'm now going to turn over to the questions which have come in since Joe's previous one. Bob, you had a question about super funds being pulled. Is it and could you just articulate your question, or is it one that's already been asked?
Yes, thanks, Henry. You can hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a rumour back in January that the Pension Superfund was either being mothballed or pulled, and therefore wasn't going ahead. And obviously that caused concern because obviously Clara needs some alternatives, and trustees can't really make a decision to go to Clara if there is no alternative option to them other than buyout. So it's very, very important that the Pension Superfund does get off the ground, and I was delighted to see that the Treasury DWP, Laura Trott, have had a change of heart over the direction of policy, and really looking for reassurance, Eddie, that if you can get the regulations, the DWP Treasury, to agree that the backers of a pension super fund can get their dividends out, they can get a return on their investment, that the pension super fund will proceed.
Well, we shall see, but certainly both Luke and I would like very much to see this long-running saga come to an end and be able to actually provide the solutions that you've outlined. Subject to, of course, to seeing the devil in the detail of the guidelines as they come out.
I wish you luck.
We were asked by government to set this up. Goodness knows, Luke, must have been almost 6 years ago now.
That's right, yeah.
And we've spent millions of pounds.
7, actually, I think, nearly.
Thank you for making my day. And we spent millions and millions of pounds and many, many, many hours trying to put something together. And so you can imagine that, as Luke referred to earlier, it's been a somewhat frustrating process, to put it mildly. I don't think any of us emerged with enormous credit from it. And we want to finish the game. We never surrender, as Mr. Churchill would have put it.
And
It's great to hear. It's great to hear.
Yes. Philip, would you like to come up? You had some questions. Member.
Thanks, Henry. Sorry if this seems to be a bit of a naive question, but all the discussion at the moment is about Superfund as an investment vehicle, and just what is the scope of its services to the member? Would it get involved in helping members who are interested in transferring or other retirement options or general retirement in itself?
Hi, Philip. I did respond to this one in the chat, but happy to say for everybody's benefit. I mean, as Anthony noted earlier in the chat, we would obviously be preserving all of the existing arrangements for transferring members. So any options that are embedded in their current scheme would be preserved. And the gold standard member experience is absolutely our aspiration. With scale, it's possible to dilute the costs of delivering that, and so we'd certainly hope to add value in other areas of retirement planning and so forth. That's another way of sharing the upsides of scale.
Thank you, Luke.
That's that's part of, I think, being responsible corporate citizens, as it were. But clearly, that's obviously commercially sensible to improve the attractiveness of the offer to members and their potential seeding trustees.
Thanks, Luke. Sorry, I've only just seen your reply. Thank you.
I mean, it is an interesting question. Once you've been transferred into a super fund, is there any way out? I mean, there isn't any way out of the PPF. You're there. Is it different for you guys? I'm talking about pre-retirement.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're still a member of an occupational pension scheme. You still have pension freedoms.
Yeah.
So you can transfer in or transfer out or do whatever you like. And I should clarify also that we take on whatever benefit structure you may enjoy today. So we're not changing the pensions promise on people by them being transferred by their trustees into Pension Superfund. So we don't see there's any particular downside to that. Still a member of the PPF, etc. So that what we are also looking at is how best to help on the sort of aligned DC provision. Because, for example, if you have a Christmas bonus and you're still below retirement age, we basically want to be putting that money into a DC pension for you, personal pension, rather than paying it out with a large tax charge. So we're trying to move in a way beyond just the super fund and think about how else we can be helping pensioners along their journey.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Okay. Joe has got a second question. Do you want to ask it, Joe?
Oh, thank you, Henry. I've got a couple, actually. I'll ask the first one. Yeah. Eddie and Luke, what can you tell us about the setup and the relationship between the trustees and the executive? I mean, do the trustees have final say over the investment strategy?
Yeah, I can answer that one, Eddie, if you like. I mean, absolutely, yes, they do, Joe. For the last two iterations of our model, that has been the case. So the investment strategy is completely a matter for the trustees.
Thank you. And I had a quick follow-up question. Is that okay, Henry, if I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the other question was, in terms of the benefits, once members have joined the Pension Superfund, is there any possibility that those benefits could be reduced in future? Can you give us any assurances that is something that you would or wouldn't do? Well,
I mean, it's certainly not part of our model, and it's not really a legal reality at the present time. So yeah, the only circumstance in which our members' benefits might be reduced was if the superfund failed and was transferred to the PPF.
So that's a commitment not to reduce benefits in future?
Well, as I don't know how we would, even if we wanted to, but this is all about improving member benefits where possible. And that certainly starts with preserving them.
Thank you.
I suppose many people will consider the proximity of Pension Superfund to disruptive capital as being almost a sort of a fait accompli, that you're going to be using private equity heavily in your investment strategy. Is that the case, Eddie? I mean, is the intention to get heavily involved in long-term assets as an investment strategy for the fund?
I should just clarify that Disruptive Capital is now in the process of being wholly owned by our charitable foundation. So that's always a good start. At the end of the day, it's up to the trustees which investment strategy they adopt. We certainly are promoting long-term assets for pension funds generally, or pension savers generally, because if nothing else, the Mansion House reforms would suggest it would be a good idea for pension funds to invest billions of pounds into productive assets. And long-term assets was designed to be a vehicle to help do that in a low cost, dare I say it myself, well-managed way. Do it through a governance structure that has been carefully developed with, for example, input from the TPR, to make sure that it's got an independent board, that that board decides ultimately on who its investment managers will be or won't be. And what we think there's a real need for is a one-stop shop for particularly smaller funds or DC pension fund type savers to have just buy one share. You don't have to worry about limited partnership agreements and all the complexities of private markets. To do that in a low-cost way, so well within the charge cap in terms of charging 55 basis points a year to manage that, which is market leading in terms of fees. To do that in a diversified way, so that you've got private equity, you've got private credit, and so on, so that you've got as it builds up a wider and wider portfolio of private markets. I'd also say that actually, if we look at the international comparators, the Canadian pension plan, or the endowments such as Wellcome Trust, where my late brother was CIO, or Yale, or the Australians, or whoever it might be, basically over 20, 30 years, they have absolutely demonstrated that an allocation to private markets provides better outcomes. And the OECD signed off on that. And so we also look at our experience at the London Pension Fund Authority, where Luke and I were for a few years. We put a heavy proportion of that pension fund, about 45% allocation, into a diversified range of private markets, long-term assets. We also put 50% of that pension fund into a buy and hold global equity portfolio, and it came up with remarkably good outcomes. So that, broadly speaking, the funding ratio doubled over 7 years, and that's good for pensioners, it's good for the taxpayers of London. We were, of course, backed by a very strong credit in London as a covenant, and we're able to take investment risk as a consequence. But it's the right thing to do for the long term.
Moving on, could you just talk a little bit? It's not structured as an LTAF, is it? It's structured as an investment trust, if I'm right in remembering.
It's an investment company, technically, to be listed on the London Stock Exchange once they finally get round to it. And we had a lot of debate. I mean, we created long-term assets as an investment company before the LTAF regime came into being. I think I'm on the public record to say I'm not persuaded by the LTAF regime. It's a funny sort of camel, in that it's got elements of the sort of property REITs that every few years have to be gated because people want their money back. So it's half open and half closed, and we think a pure play, closed-end investment company is a better way to go.
Would this be the kind of investment you would expect DC Master Trusts to be making? Absolutely,
and we're already in advanced conversations with two significant Master Trusts to come in there. And moreover, in discussions with Treasury and the British Business Bank to make the LIFTS program an option within long-term assets, so that if you're investing into asset classes that are perceived to be riskier, such as life sciences or technology, that actually the government is prepared to, in principle, stand behind that and create a sort of first loss guarantee, if that's the right word. And again, I would emphasize we're standing on the shoulders of very, very capable sub-managers. And so we don't profess to be expert at everything by any means, and we very much want to harness the best managers we can find in the world to help provide the investment management at a sub level, which we've successfully managed to do, and then just invest for the long term by crushing fees down. More of the returns go to shareholders, and therefore indirectly go to pension members. And certainly in our experience and the experience of many very large international pension funds, that produces better outcomes.
Okay. You've been mentioned in connection with the purchase of a master trust. Is that connected with what you were talking about earlier, about giving members an option to invest in a DC arrangement as part of their being in the super fund?
Yeah, well, that is a public takeover, so I can't comment too much on it, but certainly that was one of the thoughts. And it's secondly that in our travels around a lot of the corporate world, the finance director just wants to never hear the word pension again. I'm sorry to everybody on this call, but not everybody shares our group excitement about pensions. And they just want to get the problem off their plate, whether it's DB or DC or hybrid or CIS or SAS. Well, just guys, just take it away, please.
So a one-stop shop, a vertically integrated pension super fund with DC's options, investment options, which are closely aligned to what you think, and so on. I guess looking at that, it's pretty much the Eddie Truell show, isn't it?
Well, I always listen to what people like Luke have to say to me. Don't worry, it never works. Honestly, I've been investing, I should say, for 30 plus years. And it always comes down to having, firstly, an excellent management team. Secondly, strategically at a sort of board level or investor level, having a diverse group of opinions and experiences. And that's really important. There is no monopoly of wisdom. And I would extend that diversity to age as well as to the more obvious things as well. And certainly in the financial crisis of 2008, I benefited enormously when I was running Pension Insurance Corporation from having fabulous people like Sir Mark Weinberg and Sir Martin Jacob, who'd actually lived through the 1973-4 crisis, which was in many ways much greater than 2008. They could actually say, look, this is what happened then. This is what we should be thinking about. And they'd lived through those hard times. And that was invaluable. And one's a fool, frankly, to ignore the benefit of a wider group of experiences.
Okay, I was being facetious when I said that this was all about you, but clearly you're somebody who has a very clear idea of what he wants and how you can deliver what you want to the pensions industry. Yeah, and I don't know of anybody else who's got quite that scope of vision and that capacity to deliver, because you get the access to the capital that others don't. So from your own personal point of view, Eddie, you're a man in the fullness of life and so on. How important is this to you? You've got loads of other things out there. Is this something that you're really going to see through?
As I said before, I'm a persistent little bugger, and this is the right thing to do. I mean, I was privileged enough to work at London with Luke and again, a really great body of trustees and executives there. And I can't say I was exactly well paid for it, but we did the right thing. And we used, what I'd like to think of is that was in a way a bit of a poster child, particularly for the LGPS, fostering the super pools, merging pension funds, LGPS pension funds to create better outcomes. And that has already made some significant strides towards that. So London, as I referred to earlier, has done very well with its investments. The super pooling movement is already producing significant cost efficiencies, and also by having scale is able to deploy big lumps of capital into infrastructure projects, for example, that those infrastructure projects are just not available to small pension funds. And so that's where scale is all important. So I'm completely with the zeitgeist that is now there, that we need to consolidate. We need to consolidate investment vehicles. We need to consolidate pension funds, and we need to deliver the better outcomes as a result.
And you're the man to do it.
No, I'm part of a team to do it. Thank you, Henry.
Okay. Coming back, there are a couple of technical questions which have also come in. John, you're on the call. You were asking a question about Superfund benefits being charged on the way in. I take it some kind of haircut on benefits is something that you're worried about. Are you wanting to ask that question yourself? Come off mute. Have to be a bit careful because sometimes people who aren't visible aren't there. Well, I'll put it to you. Is there a haircut that's taken by members when they go into the pension super funds?
Well, I mean, I can give a bit of sophistry there, Henry. No is always the answer, because our transfer mechanism preserves the existing benefits. But I mean, it's a matter for the seeding trustees if their scheme is underfunded and they have some particular wish to transfer, either because the sponsor has failed or there is some other troubling event. If they wish to go through some exercise to right size the benefits so that the economics work and the super funds trustees are able to accept the transfer, then that's a matter for them. But the transfer mechanism for us is very, very clear. Whatever the seeding trustees and trustee rules say at that particular time, that is the benefit structure that we will provide.
For pension geeks among us, Anthony's put in an interesting response there. Anthony Barker, I know is part of your organisation. DWP in their consultation response mooted the possibility of right-sizing benefits to available assets for schemes and assessments. This would put super funds on a level playing field with insurance companies who already do this. However, it would need primary legislation to overturn the Halcrow judgment. Can you just explain what Anthony is talking about in terms of the Halcrow judgment and about this whole business of right sizing? Because it's not something I think a lot of people would immediately understand.
Oh gosh, I mean, Halcrow is a bit of one of those cold towel topics. Eddie, I don't know if it's if you feel ready to go on it. You're on mute, which is possibly not unwise with this one.
Well, yeah, it gave me time to think. Yes, so we've seen a strange situation where sponsors have gone bust, pension funds are in PPF assessment, looking for outcomes, and insurance companies can essentially pay higher benefits than the PPF minimum, but lower benefits than the original pension promise. That freedom is not available to anybody other than an insurer. So again, anti-competitive. And we believe that actually in many of those cases we could have delivered and could still in the future deliver better pension outcomes, some of which will be less certain, are shared outcomes, share of the surplus as they emerge, but nonetheless offer a reasonable prospect of pensioners actually getting back to their full pension promise, which they'll never get when they go into an insurance buyout. They're locked in, that's the number, bad luck. And so we think there's a real societal need for greater flexibility in right sizing, or whatever the phrase is, benefits in those troubled situations. And had indeed we been around and authorized or assessed, as the regulator prefers to put it, tens of thousands of people might have been somewhat better off than they are today.
Peter Cameron Brown, you are on the call. Would you like to ask your question, which is vaguely related to this in terms of benefits in relation to PPF?
Yes, thank you very much, Henry. And I should, just picking up on that last point, I have to declare my interest. I am a person who has suffered very much from a PPF assessment, which was refused the scheme entry, and the benefits had to be bought out with an insurance company on a PPF plus a very little and no prospect of improvement. So I'm now suffering greatly. But that was the second point. My question was, if the pension superfund mirrors the original scheme's benefit structure, how would you deal with the situation of the scheme in surplus against the main benefits, which has discretionary benefits such as pension increases above the cap level, if appropriate? And the second part of it was if there is a possibility that PPF benefit levels could be raised to 100% of scheme benefits, either voluntarily or generally, what would be the benefit to members of a consolidation into the pension superfund?
Let me take the first and perhaps give Luke the possible pass of the second. Over my time in the pensions world, I have been involved in a number of so-called capital-backed journey plans, whereby we assumed the role of the formerly somewhat troubled sponsor and helped look after the pension fund. And in those cases, or in some of those cases, we were able to use a surplus in the pension fund to give one-off improvements to benefits. So in the case of the Thorn pension fund, as an example, some 10,000 people got a pay increase, as you might say, between 5 and 7%, which they were very happy about. And in other cases, if I think of, for example, Threshers, the wine merchant that then went bust later, again, we were able to pay out in the fullness of time full benefits to pensioners, still get Christmas cards from them, because otherwise they'd have been put into the PPF and had a haircut, as you sadly have experienced yourself.
Yeah, and I think clearly every scheme is different in this respect, and that is part of the analysis that potential seeding trustees will have to conduct in terms of how our rules compare to the alternatives, be that status quo or transfer to the PPF potentially. So yeah, we do have a baked-in mechanism for sharing surpluses, but it is possible there exist schemes out there whose kind of default treatment of a surplus is more generous than the structure available to the trustees under the super fund, and that's just an assessment trustees will have to make on a scheme by scheme basis.
Thank you.
Okay, and refer you to comments made by Anthony Barker and in the comments section there for more detail. I'm very conscious, guys, that we're coming to the end of an hour with Eddie and Luke, and very grateful to them for making themselves available at short notice. Has anyone got a further question that they'd like to ask now? Don't feel any need to put your hand, just come off mute, and if we get a whole lot of people asking a question at the same time, that's fine.
Well, if I may then, perhaps, Henry, thank you very much indeed, and thank everybody for the really engaged and interesting discussion. Certainly gave us food for thought. Really appreciated that. I must go and see what I can do to help roll out fibre optic cables for one of our investee companies, Telent, hence the BT group behind me. But I'd like to thank everybody for their time and as I said, really helpful thinking and questions.
And of course, if you would like to follow up anything else, do feel free to reach out to Anthony, Eddie, or myself.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, if you'd like to ask any further questions, then email myself or Henry, and we can pass any questions on. And such a great session, I think, Eddie and Luke. Thank you very much indeed, and thanks everyone for your questions, and also a lot of things going on in the chat. So lots of digital hands clapping, which is excellent as well to see. So yeah, a great session. So yeah, thanks Eddie, and thank you Luke, and thank you Henry. such an amazing market we live in. Somebody in the chat put in, what would have happened if the Mansion House speech happened 20 years ago, Eddie? Where would we be now if this happened 20 years ago? Last statement, go on.
I think UK PLC would have been in a much, much better place. And I think millions of pensioners would be in a better place, if that's a one-line answer.
Well, it is.
Yeah.
It is.
Thanks,
Yeah.
John Spain, for asking the question. Yeah.
And thanks to John for asking the question.
Okay.
Very interesting. So
Right,
I
well,
see
we're
this as
gonna
an
go
opportunity. So we're gonna wrap up now, I think. Eddie, thank you. Luke, thank you. Next week we've got Aon talking about investments and maybe something about liquids, which is what Eddie and Luke like as well. Thank you much for joining today. If you like Playpen, please share with other Playpen members. If you are not on Playpen, please register. We'd love to have you on board. As usual on these sessions, we always like to pray for peace in the East. There was talk this week on the news that Putin is talking about peace. So it's now August, Henry, and I can't believe we're still in this situation, but let's pray for peace in the East. I hope you enjoyed today's session. It's been very useful. Next week, we'll go back to our 10:30 session as usual with Aon. And as I say, if you'd like any... Yeah, go on, Henry. Sorry, go on.
Steve, we did actually say that we would keep the call open if anyone wanted to stay on it, just because a lot of people did come on the call at 10:30, missing the early start, may have half an hour free in their diary, may just want to have a chat.
Does anybody want to stay on and have a chat? That's a good point. Yeah, Adrian Swales, you're with us. We'll find out.
Yeah.
If you want to stay on and have a chat, great. If not, thanks for your time today. Enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week.
Cheers.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you.
That's the end of this formal part of this music.
Let's pop. Yeah. Now we go to the informal part, and yeah, exactly. So thanks for joining, Stephen, as well. There's quite a few people staying on, which is quite interesting, isn't it? Adrian Swales. Let's unmute Adrian Swales. What does Adrian Swales think about pension super funds and what the regulator's doing at the moment? Come on, Adrian. Put your 3 penneth in is the word. Yeah. You're on mute, Adrian. You're on mute.
Put me on the spot. I was just about to go for a swim in Lake Como, actually. But,
aren't we all?
well, I think, as always with pension regulation and involvement, it seems that there are many speed humps put in the road. Question was asked about Clara. Why can't they get any schemes on board? Questions about Pension Superfund. What are the real blockers to Pension Superfund? We probably all have our own opinions and have tough questions, probably ones I wouldn't have wanted to answer. There are other DB master trusts that have been set up in the last 3 years that haven't progressed. And I think clearly this is a very significant challenge, setting up new regulatory constructs, if you like, to meet the needs. And I wonder actually whether improving the existing constructs, existing pension scheme, investment company constructs might actually be a better way forward.
Yeah, certainly when Punter Southall pulled their master trust earlier in the year, they said that there was no way they could make it work in the context of the DB funding codes. I don't know what people's views are about the DB funding code, but it does seem at the moment to be an impediment for the kind of things that people want to do, simply because there's not the option to create value under that code within a master trust, or so it seems. Is that what you were alluding to, Adrian?
Yep.
So it does come back to this question about whether or not the pension regulator is really serious about changing its mindset, or whether these are just words. Are the TPR on the warpath, or are they simply following the DWP? And is anything going to come of this? And I think that's a serious question which hasn't been answered. But I think we'll see more when we see the new guidance, which comes out in the next 2 or 3 weeks on super funds. That will be an early indicator of what's going to happen, I think, in other areas of TPR guidance. I don't know if you want to comment, Anthony. It's just a little bit too difficult.
Not really. I mean, I mean, I think all the conversations we've had of late with TPR would suggest that new guidance will mirror the DWP consultation, and all other things being equal, that would probably make pricing about 3% cheaper than it was. Yeah, the difference is now is, as I've just put in the chat, you know, sponsors' cost of capital has increased dramatically, and if you take it in the context also of the reaction to the LDI issues last year, where there's going to be less leverage, smaller sort of pots of available return-seeking assets for schemes to make the numbers work. Yeah, schemes that possibly thought they had very short time frames to sort of invest their way out probably aren't there any longer, because they, you know, they're perhaps going to depend more on their sponsor. Their sponsor can't afford increasing contributions. On the other hand, you know, super funds could effectively give everybody that runway at an affordable rate. So, but I think we're led to believe TPR are going to be responding in the next 2 weeks on the guidance, and we'll be in a much better position there to understand how much they've moved.
Yeah.
What's your view, Bob? Are you are you for or against, or on the fence, or
for or against what, Steve?
Well, you know, this sort of
Kylian Mbappe going to Saudi Arabia, you know, all the really important issues.
Really important.
Steve, exactly. I've been a long advocate to say that the DB funding code should be binned in its current form, particularly when the regulator was trying to use gilts plus a quarter as being the basis for actually valuing a pension scheme. I thought that was restricting the ability of actuaries to do their job and advising and giving advice to trustees. Completely wrong. I have spoken a couple of times with David Fairs since he has left the TPR, and I was very pleased to see that he did a blog for LCP suggesting that the DB funding code might be sort of changing its direction. I'd like to see it hit the long grass and stay there. But I think that, you know, as Anthony, as you've said, TPR will just probably make some minor adjustments to it, and it will come out at some point in future. But one of the comments which I think I can share when I did speak to David was that if he had got the job of CEO of the TPR, he would have been effecting change over a longer term frame, and that's with Borsika Delfras coming in. It's his belief that she will make change in the TPR at a much faster rate than he would have done had he got that job. And that suggests that somewhere within the DWP and Treasury and the FCA, that they do understand that the TPR does need to change. Unfortunately, as I think John Spain was suggesting, it's between sort of 16 to 20 years too late, because we've basically wrecked what was a very good DB sort of set up because of changes in the accounting profession and the way the regulators really overseen deficit contribution payments, etc., over the last 15 years or so. So yes, Steve, I would like to see the DB funding code basically kicked into the long grass and forgotten about, and go back to normal sort of actuaries doing normal valuations in a normal way without restriction. And it is very important that pension funds should be able to run off their benefits, pay them as they fall due over the long term, and not be forced into buying out with insurance companies. And it's just wrong.
Sounds like we could have a coffee morning session on that, Bob. Ditch the DB funding code and get the actuaries to join together, and you know.
The actuaries won't, because they're all afraid that they're having to follow the sort of that their organisations diktat, that they can't be out there saying things which are not the current status flavour of the month. they can't be seen to be opposing the regulator because it's potentially it's not good for their career. I can get away with it because I'm not an actuary.
Well, maybe we should pick up the baton for them. So yeah.
Anthony, what do you think?
What do you think, Adrian? Do you think that do you think, yeah, or Anthony, do you think DB code should be abolished, amended, dropped? I don't
know. The problem has always been that it's a one-size-fits-all philosophy, or because you've got such a diversity arrangements and scheme sizes, and I think this has been the challenge, is that probably about sort of 60% of schemes now are sub £100 million in value, and therefore the diversity of advice and sort of things. So Bob's point is perhaps well made, but and it's probably true within the larger consulting houses. I think there are bigger issues. I mean, one of the things that always fascinated me is the tie-up between the actuarial and the accounting professions. And I always remember when I was at Santander, Deloitte, who were auditing, challenging on me on the fact that I didn't have addresses for 25% of my deferred members, and was this material? And I said, well, but as at a bank level, you don't get worried about sort of amounts more of sort of, I think it was about 10 or 15 million, and yet you never go and ask the scheme actuary, how did he decide whether the discount rate should be gilts plus 0.8 versus gilts 0.83 or 0.75 or 0.9? And as I said, as a financial impact, that has by far the bigger impact on the reported numbers as to whether I know where Mrs. Jones' third husband is currently living. Yeah. I think there was one of the questions I think in the chat was the focus on the discount rate and that, and we do get a bit hung up on the wrong things. On what a lot of stuff is very, very subjective.
Sorry, what you were going to say something, Adrian? Go on. Do you agree on that?
He was just ordering his cocktail for his poolside, for the poolside,
after he's been for a swim. Yeah. Very nice.
Yeah, no, I agree with both. I think it is one size fits all. It is, you're tinkering with something fundamentally probably be introduced in the first place, and therefore you're always going to get a suboptimal outcome. But is there the will to chat? Is there enough will to go out and make the change for people to go and make those comments? I suspect not.
I've just got the feeling that TPR were trying to actually sort of set out the specification how an actuarial valuation should be done, including how the assumptions are actually arrived at. And that's taking away the actuary's right to use their common sense, basically.
But it is the model that's used in most of continental Europe, though.
Well, that reflects.
In fact, actually, quite a lot of countries have a prescriptive set of, the role of the actuary is much more of a compliance function, and assumptions are set centrally.
But Anthony, if you go back many years, if you take the German model, it was all about being very prescriptive and being investing in sort of risk-free investments. Supposedly gilts have always been talked about as being risk-free. I've never ever talked about gilts as being a risk-free investment. They can vary and be as volatile as equities, as was demonstrated last September. So it's coming back to getting literally advisors to trustees to be looking outside the box and actually, rather than following very prescriptive rules and regulations. And if you set down procedures and you have a rule book as to what you're supposed to achieve, and you can look at the FCA with the rule book they've got for independent financial advisors, there's hundreds and hundreds of pages of advice, but does it stop things going wrong? No, it doesn't. What it does stop is actually new ideas coming out, and it stops innovation. It makes things very what's the word? It becomes very much like administration is seen to be sort of a function. It's not something that can generate sort of, it does things as opposed to, it's a utility basically, rather than actually something which can be useful. And I think, from what Eddie has done with disruptive capital and what you're trying to do, Anthony, with Pension Superfund and the like, you're trying to bring back the opportunity for pensions to actually be generative in terms of actually doing good for the UK, doing good for the membership, actually providing value for the people who are actually backing it and providing a benefit, as opposed to, if you go to an insurance contract, you're guaranteeing the benefits, but who's going to benefit at the end of the day? It's going to be the shareholders of the insurance company. And I've raised a point that
no, Rob, you've got it misunderstood. Before super funds, no one had ever made profits out of pension schemes. It's a complete fabrication that you're trying to suggest there. Everybody operates on a pro bono basis. Not-for-profit organisations. It's just such a slur you're throwing on the advisors and the asset managers and the lawyers.
I'm glad you made that point, Anthony, because it's very, very well made. It's
I'm quite sure that the 2.25 million that was taken out of USS by one of their employees was all given to charity.
Of course, yeah. Now, Henry, one of the things that was mentioned today, and probably one of the last bits we need to talk about, I guess, is about this PPF. Noticing on the PPF 23-24 funding position, they're funded to 156%. So that's quite a good position, isn't it?
Yeah, somebody mentioned the 100% PPF backing proposal put forward by LCP, where you paid a premium and you got 100% protection. I don't know what your feelings are about that, Anthony. That's quite an interesting development.
It's in the DWP consultation document.
Yeah, they mention it, don't they, Peter? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yeah.
How does that look for you?
Well, as I responded to Peter in the chat, it's not a costless exercise. You can set. I first think you have to remember, I was involved in designing the PPF. What it came before it, and that was that if you wound up a scheme, the priority orders was that the pensioners got everything and the deferred's got about 10 pence in the pound. And so at least the PPF compensation gave everybody a sort of a minimum underpin. But the younger you are, and there are still members in schemes who are in their sort of late 30s, early 40s, and that the actual going into the PPF, if you only get compensation, is more akin to about a 25% haircut by value. People know about the headline 10% rate, but because you get lower spouses benefits, you get lower future increases. It's more like a 25% cut. So if you're going to go to full benefits, that's got to be funded from somewhere. And whilst there may be some scope for PPF using some of its accrued surplus to do it, you're going to clearly get rid of quite a lot of it fairly quickly. And then you just have to fund it with higher levy payments for everyone else thereafter, either paid as a direct levy or in some sort of excess insurance policy.
I think the LCP idea was that firms who wanted to benefit from this 100% PPF protection would pay a super levy for that extra insurance.
Well, it becomes a trade. It's an interesting trade-off of, why would you want to do it? If you don't believe you're going to fail as a company, you've got a sort of schedule of contributions to supposedly fund your scheme to self-sufficiency. Why, should you be worried about going into the PPF?
Basically, to get the TPR off your back, isn't it?
You can already put in place contingent assets and other ways of minimising your levy. So there's lots of ways of managing the levy cost. But ultimately, if you're going to have an industry-wide offer, then it'll have to be paid for industry-wide as well.
Yes, I think Con Keating in previous meetings suggested that in fact the increase in the levy to increase it to 100% would be 14% of the current levy levels.
Yep, no, that would seem about right.
Yes. I do
we
wonder.
get through an hour and a half without mentioning Con, but we failed.
Sorry.
Sorry, Peter.
There you go.
Oh. We've also got through an hour and a half without mentioning Derek. Are you still there, Derek?
I think Derek
Very
is
nice
there,
to see you if
or
you are.
I am,
he is there, yeah.
Henry, but I'm doing something else as usual. My reaction to the PPF funding level is that it's there because of a dodgy discount rate, and I think we're being inconsistent. We criticise the discount rate used by USS, but we seem to be very happy to accept the PPF's discount rate. I would argue, as Anthony has kind of said, it needs to fund these things.
Yeah, fair comment.
Yeah. So I mean,
fair comment.
If I was a trustee, I would be scaling back, basing it, because they're using a gilts relative discount rate to get 156%, and I don't think this gilts yield has stabilised in any way. Could go in either direction.
Well, almost everything that we do is based around that gilts rate on the DB side, and it crops up again and again in consultations, doesn't it, Anthony? I mean, you're not. I was going to say guilt free, and then I thought that's entirely the wrong connotation.
Guilt free.
Yeah, I'm nice. Well, no, yeah, no, I regret nothing.
Or guilty.
Yeah, no, yeah, sure regret. Yeah. I mean, I always remember the first presentation I ever did to the bank board at Santander, and I took discounting off and showed them the conventional sort of humpback whale chart and demonstrated that the future cash flows added up to, at that point in time, £27 million. And the scheme had been closed for 12 years. So as I sort of, let the board off, I said, look, this was a promise made not by me, and it wasn't made by you. It was down to your predecessors. But ultimately, your predecessors have promised 27 billion in future pension payouts. And as of today, I've got 6.5 billion in the scheme and a bank that is probably worth around about 15 to 16 billion if it was able to list. And so unless I can have the entire value of the bank put into the pension scheme on top of what I've already got, we have no option but to invest in a risky fashion to make up the shortfall. And I think that's always been the corollary of the LDI thing, is that people just didn't realise where the balance of costs was going to come from if you removed all return seeking from your asset portfolio.
If you removed all return seeking from your asset portfolio,
yeah. So I mean, discount rates are the discount rate sort of debate, or at least the choice of discount, is helpful in trying to identify, at some part what the cost of your liabilities are. But and it was better than the alternative where we used to have made up assets and made up liabilities in the actuarial profession. But as to what the right discount rate is and how that sort of ties into your investment strategy will very much, as I said, is how much return you can guarantee. And unfortunately, taking more risk doesn't necessarily guarantee more return.
It's part of the problem, isn't it, Anthony? You can't guarantee the returns that you've got without actually removing risk. And why invest? Why not just do a pay-as-you-go, which is what the government does for civil service scheme, etc., and teachers. So if you're going to hold a pot of money to pay out benefits, you need to do something with it, and you need to invest it, and you need someone who knows what they're doing with it, basically. So
yeah, and I think the thing is, what's happened, the sort of end game strategy, is it's the time frame that has been cut back in, and what super funds do is it pushes back out the sort of, I suppose, expected life of a pension scheme before it has to do something. I'm working on a scheme at the moment that's probably 16 to 20 years away from being able to secure benefits elsewhere. And that's probably a lot longer than the expected life of the sponsor. And I think that's probably a not uncommon scenario for most DB sponsors, given that they are historically old industry, old retail type setups.
Yes, I think the point you've touched on is the importance of actually the cash flow. And in terms of the funding, we are using basically long-term assumptions in a situation where for many schemes now the short term is becoming far more dominant. So it's actually what is going to pay your pensions over the next year or 2 years that is critical to the eventual outcome to the scheme. And where is that cash flow coming in? How much of your capital asset base do you have to sell in that period to prejudice the future? And I think that's probably where I would suggest the funding codes should be focusing attention on, to make trustees think about that particular pattern. It's just my personal message.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Just as a general question, Anthony, is a semi-informal, so you don't have to answer it. This is still without the public about it, but I mean, you're doing this job, and you're talking about the things that you're doing, on a day-to-day basis. How satisfying is it for you? Are you getting a lot out of this?
Oh yeah, I mean, my career has never been sort of premised on doing, cyclical valuations. I like doing difficult and trying to find sort of ways round and through. I mean, I think it comes back to almost a point that Bob was sort of half alluding to, but possibly wasn't thinking of it. The problem with most of the advisory industry is that, well, one, they don't advise, they only provide information, but two, the training they get and their career experience is not designed for dealing with difficult scenarios. And very few have worked for companies or banks or sort of even the more business advisory focus, the big audit firms and everything. So yeah, their understanding of the challenges of a corporate and the capital and how you deal with tax and capital and everything is, non-existent, and likewise, actuarial calculations are all predicated on the world being tax-free, which it most definitely doesn't. And I think that's always the bit that's frustrated me most, is that the world is a lot more complicated and schemes are a lot more complicated and companies are a lot more complicated than regulation and advice would allow for. And so, I spend more of my day advising the advisors so that they can go off and talk to a client. And there's an inevitable degree of Chinese whispers goes on in that. And I think there's one of the people in the chat said, a question, and I said, well, the response to this is the advisory community and their stakeholders are looking for both regulatory certainty, as in super funds or alternative covenant schemes get positively approved, but also they get executed. And once execution starts happening and it becomes a more normal product, then I think we'll see a lot more volumes. I mean, people forget that bulk annuities have only realistically been going for about sort of 12, 14 years. They haven't been around for 100 years.
No, and the people who really started that trend off are the people who are now moving on to pension super funds.
Yeah.
One of the other problems with pension super funds and Clara not getting any clients so far is that the lawyers are very risk averse in giving advice, and any advisors, legal advisors of trustees, will normally basically say, why do it? But I've yet to come across a pensions lawyer we would recommend to a trustee in the right circumstances that make the transfer. It's back to sort of organisations being risk averse and their PI insurance telling them, follow the corporate line, whatever that corporate line is. So, yeah, Clara.
Oh, indeed, and lawyers are the only ones that do have to give advice and are liable for it.
Well, the actual profession, the investment consultants as well.
It is so much easier to throw a red flag than not.
Absolutely.
And that's unfortunately nobody gets paid, for saying it's a risk, but I think it's one you should take. So we see risk aversion as a problem. One of the final question in Helen Thomas's article is, why should trustees take more risk? And in the current regulatory environment, the answer to that question is they shouldn't. That's what.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that, Henry. I think it's not a question should they take more risks, because they are not operating a risk-free proposition, and therefore the question is, how do they take more rewarded risks? If there is the proverbial cure for cancer tomorrow, that will rip through every scheme, insurance company, PPF, and has implications for society as a whole. So, there is no such thing as a risk-free approach here. But that, unfortunately, is where a lot of trustees, and again, we can blame the actuarial and other industry professions for the jargon, but, there is no such thing as a risk-free asset.
No, but if you're told that you're about to take on risk, then that gives you a blood-curdling feeling if you're a trustee. Because you have been brought up in a risk-averse environment, and the regulator has been telling you that they are a risk-based regulator, with the emphasis being on take less risk for 20 years, for as long as TPR have been around. Is it 20 years now? God. I think we're going to have to wind this brilliant conversation up, but thank you very much indeed, guys. And let's hope that the pension regulator is, as Eddie said, looking to change its mindsets.
Indeed, absolutely. Thank you for joining, Bob. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you,
Derek. And thank you, Anthony,
Henry.
as well, for staying on as well.
Anthony.
Really useful.
No worries.
Great
Cheers,
session.
Anthony.
Absolutely
Derek,
fantastic.
Peter.
All right.
Cheerio.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye. Bye.